Hey everybody, it's good to be back here with you all today. So today we are continuing our series on the Old Testament. Woohoo! So far we have covered how it came together, how we read it as United Methodists, the Torah, aka the first 5 books, and the history books, which tell the stories of the kings and covered some of the major historical events. The main overarching themes we've covered is that God entered into a covenant with us, promising to never leave or forsake us. And as part of that covenant, God gives us the law so we can learn how to not be terrible to our neighbors, to God, and to nature, so that we can uphold our end of the covenant. But there is more to the Old Testament than the Torah and the history books. There are 4 books that are known as the short stories: Ruth, Esther, Jonah, and Job. These books are short and they tell one story about one specific person for a specific reason. The stories take place at different times in history, but they were all written down during the exile. Now, while I'm telling us about the history books last time, Nick talked about this a little bit, but as a refresher, because I know you've slept since then, the exile was one of the worst periods in Israelite history. Babylon conquered them and took all the rich and powerful people out of their land and kept them exiled for 70 years. So while they were exiled, foreigners from other lands were moving into Israel, aka the Promised Land. There were Jews that remained behind, but they were left with no king and no government structure and an economy in shambles. The foreigners started moving in, and with everything kind of a mess, it was a ripe situation to create like this whole new culture. So 70 years passes, Persia conquers Babylon, and Persia told all the exiled Israelites, we don't need you anymore. You can go if you want. And many of them did, but they were faced with this new landscape. Their home, the Promised Land, did not look much like the home that they remembered. There were foreigners in their land, which the Torah expressly forbid. So they were left with the question of what to do. Now, the socio-historical context is extremely important to understanding both Ruth and Jonah, and it also gives us great background for Esther, which is why, of course, we covered this first. And at this point, I'm going to hand this off to Pastor Winter, who's going to tell us more about these amazing short stories.
So at that point, some of the people who were writing what we now know as the Old Testament were saying things like, we should not hang out with any foreigners at all. It should just be us, and we should work on being pure. And I don't know, for some reason I'm thinking of Harry Potter now. You don't want to hang out with people of like mixed bloods, right? But the law, the Torah, is pretty clear. It said things like, no foreigners shall be admitted to the assembly. There's even one about a Moabite in Deuteronomy chapter 23 that says if a Moabite it tries to come into the assembly, they can't for 10 generations. You have to like have babies made 10 generations down before a Moabite is allowed to enter the assembly. So there were, after the exile, there were these Israelites who thought we could stay a pure people. And then there were Israelites who were like, no. At this point, many of the Hebrew believed that there was only one God. That actually didn't really happen till the exile. And if there's only one God, then that God is the God of me and the God of the foreigners. So maybe we should learn how to live alongside one another? It's a bold and radical idea. So at the same time as you have some Israelites writing stories and ideas about how we should remain a pure-blooded people and not mingle with foreigners, you have other people writing the other narrative, that maybe we should figure out how to live peacefully with our neighbors. And that's where we get to the last 4 books that were written down in the Old Testament. The first one we're going to talk about is the story of Esther. So Esther actually takes place among the Jewish diaspora in the Persian kingdom. So these are like the Jewish people who remained kind of under the Persian kingdom and were working in that kingdom. And it's the story of a young woman who saves her people. They were about to get slaughtered. And she's able to stand up for them. And she's able to say, like, I'm going to use my voice at the right time for such a time as this to make sure that the right things happens for my people. It's a story about how to live as a foreigner in a land where your people are not in charge. It's a pretty good point. Also, interesting fact, Esther doesn't use the word God at all in that book. It's a fantastic story. Okay, then the other one is Ruth. Now, this is really interesting. So Ruth is historical fiction. That means it's not a real story of like a real person, but it takes place in like a real time period. So Ruth says that Ruth takes place in the time of the judges. So that's like after the people had been wandering in the wilderness, but before the kingdom was established. So that's like when Ruth takes place. Except Ruth wasn't written down until like the 4th or 5th century BCE, while the Persians were in charge. So why? Also, the way the book starts out kind of has a opening that's similar to Once Upon a Time. The Hebrew alludes to the fact that it's a story. Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, has 2 boy children, and their names, when translated, come up with terms like sickly and death. So the story goes, once upon a time, there's this woman named Naomi, and both of her sons, sickly and death, die. Anyway, it ends up being about this foreign wife named Ruth, one of Naomi's daughter-in-laws. And they go on this wonderful tale together, and it's a good book. It's worth a read. But what's really interesting is Ruth is a Moabite. So whoever wrote this story down wrote down this heroine story about one of the Israelites that was actually a Moabite. Not just a foreigner, but like the worst kind of foreigner, according to Torah. And then makes Ruth, places her in the time of the judges, and places her in a bloodline that makes it look like she is King David's great-grandmother, the most beloved and revered king. What better way than to say Moabites and foreigners are welcome to be part of the assembly? Pretty clever. Something similar happens with the Book of Jonah. Jonah was also written around the 4th or 5th century BCE, and it's actually satire. The whole story is supposed to be really funny. It's only 4 chapters, and it's a good laugh. But the whole idea is that Jonah is being called by God to go to Nineveh to tell the people of Nineveh, this group of foreigners, you need to repent of your ways. So technically, Nineveh was an Assyrian capital. So these are like foreigners that are going to do us wrong. Jonah was written down around the same time as the prophetic book Nahum. The prophetic book Nahum was trying to say, no foreigners allowed. And then here comes the prophet Jonah with a very different book, saying, actually, yeah, maybe foreigners should be allowed. It's not written like the other prophetic books. It's a story. It's a well-written story. And what's interesting is, so Jonah fights his calling this whole time, and he finally goes to Nineveh and preaches, and the people actually repent. And the story ends with a question. The story ends with God speaking to Jonah. Jonah doesn't understand why all of these people have been spared. And God says, and should I not be concerned about Nineveh, the great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left? God says, what, am I not supposed to care about the people of Nineveh? Is that what you're asking me to do? So again, we see a slant, an idea that leans towards a God, one God that loves all people, including people who are not part of the assembly, including people who are foreigners. It's interesting. The last book that we're going to talk about today is the Book of Job, which actually, the beginning of Job, certain parts of Job, are some of the oldest writings that we have in the Bible. Some of the oldest oral tradition that was then written down during the exile. But what's interesting about Job is it's a book that continued to get added to, because the whole point of the Book of Job is, what do we do with evil? What do we do when bad things happen to good people? And so the very last section of Job actually was one of the last things written down. And how we know this, and this is pretty cool, is you can trace literary writing styles throughout the Book of Job to show hundreds of years of language development. Job starts in a time period when the people of God are a small community and it's only about them. And by the time the book of Job ends, the people are considering God, the God of all, the one God in charge of all of creation. It's a beautiful idea. And I think that what this points to is Jesus, who's going to be coming in a few hundred years, just a couple hundred years from the time that these last books were written down. The Hebrew people, the Israelites, were already thinking about what would it look like to have our one God truly welcome all people. Is it possible that the one God genuinely and deeply loves every single person and every bit of creation on this planet? Or is it really just us? And that's a question we see Jesus dealing with all of the time, and one that I think is worthy of our time.
Thank you, Pastor Winter. So what does this have to do with us? That's a tough one, because we don't have any issues with foreigners in 2021. We don't perpetuate harmful stereotypes about Mexicans all being drug lords, or call a deadly virus that originated in China the Kung flu, and we definitely don't look down on other nations that are comprised mainly of people with darker skin. Oh wait, we do all of those things. And at a smaller level, as middle schoolers and high schoolers, we see all the time that kids who are outsiders, who maybe look and act differently than we do, are not treated well. Or we make cliques that others cannot break into no matter what. So these lessons from the Old Testament short stories about God loving everyone and the importance of welcoming the foreigner are just as relevant today as they were 2,500 years ago. So I hope you all have a great discussion today in your small groups, and I will see you next time. Bye.